Hello everyone, before we begin the episode, I'd just like to start off by playing a promo for another true crime podcast I think you will all love, Criminology.
Hi, this is Mike Ferguson.
And this is Mike Morford, and we want to tell you about our true crime podcast, Criminology.
Launched in 2017, we've covered every kind of case you can imagine, from puzzling missing persons cases to mysterious murders.
Some of the cases we cover are the biggest in true crime history, or they're high-profile cases that are currently making headlines, while some of the cases are fascinating ones you likely haven't heard of.
We cover both solved and unsolved cases, and we have 300 episodes available to binge on right now, including full seasons on the Zodiac Killer, the Golden State Killer, and Ted Bundy.
You can listen to Criminology on your favorite player or app, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.
August 30th, 1990, Westerville, Ohio. The mother of 22-year-old Tony Lombardi returns home, assuming her son is at work. But 45 minutes later, she claims that she hears the sound of a door closing followed by footsteps, and soon discovers Tony's body on his bed. He has been shot through the head, and a gun is lying on the floor next to him, but police ruled Tony's death to be a suicide. However, Tony's family discovers injuries on his body to make them believe he was the victim of foul play and possibly murdered by another man who was angry that Tony was dating his girlfriend, but his death is never reclassified. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and on this episode, we're going to be exploring two cases involving suspicious suicides: the unexplained 1990 death of Tony Lombardi and the unexplained 1991 death of Danny Williams. Their deaths took place less than 1 year apart and are not connected to each other, but what they do have in common is that they were both featured on Unsolved Mysteries and involve young men who were supposedly the victim of self-inflicted gunshot wounds inside their own homes. But of course, their respective families have always believed that these so-called suicides were staged and that foul play took place. In Tony Lombardi's case, he was still living at home with his parents and was shot to death inside his bedroom, but his mother became convinced that Tony's killer was still inside the room with them when she returned home that night and snuck out of the house right before she discovered his body. Since Tony had been dating a woman who had a boyfriend at the time, and he supposedly threatened Tony over the situation, one theory is that things may have escalated into murder. In Danny Williams' case, he lived alone in his own house and was reportedly dead for an extended period of time before his family found his body, but the authorities ruled his death to be a suicide, possibly brought on by a recent breakup between Danny and his girlfriend. Danny's family would hire some independent forensic experts to examine the evidence, and they would discover traces of blood at the scene which did not match Danny's blood type, leading to speculation that Danny may have gotten into a struggle with an unknown party who killed him and staged his death to look like a suicide. Whatever the case, neither of these deaths has ever been reclassified as a homicide, so they continue to remain shrouded in controversy. On this episode, I'll start off by sharing the details of Tony's case before I move on to Danny's death, and then I'll provide my theories and analysis about both of them. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has nearly 80 exclusive bonus episodes and archives which are not available on a regular feed. So with all that out of the way, Let us now start off by exploring the unexplained death of Tony Lombardi. Our first story begins in 1990 in Westerville, Ohio, a northeastern suburb of Columbus located in both Franklin and Delaware counties, which had a population of around 30,000 at that time. Our first victim is 22-year-old Anthony Lombardi Jr., who goes by the name Tony. At this particular point, Tony lives at his family's townhouse with his parents Cheryl and Tony Lombardi Sr., and as far as I can tell, he is their only child. Tony has a reputation as being a fun-loving person who is close to his family and is also considered to be a real ladies' man, since he is believed to be simultaneously dating at least 3 different women at this point. He is employed at a baby food factory in Columbus, where his duties include setting up cans to be filled with formula, and he has a swing shift, meaning that he works different times on different dates. Tony was supposed to work at the factory on the evening of August 29th, but he failed to show up and did not call in. Hours later, shortly after midnight on the morning of August 30th, Cheryl Lombardi arrived home, and when she went upstairs, she claimed that she noticed the door to Tony's bedroom was closed and the light was off. Since Cheryl was unaware that Tony had not shown up for his shift, she assumed he was at work and would return home soon. Over the course of the next 45 minutes, she would perform various household tasks in which she went up and down the stairs numerous times, and she recalled the bedroom light being off the entire time. At 12:45 a.m., Cheryl retired to her own bedroom, but said she soon heard the sound of a door closing, followed by the sound of footsteps. Cheryl then went out into the hallway and noticed that the light was now on behind Tony's closed bedroom door. She approached the door and knocked on it, but got no response, so she decided to go inside, and was horrified to discover Tony's nude body resting on top of a pair of pillows on his bed. He had been shot through the head, as there was blood spatter and a bullet hole on the bed's headboard, as well as a .38 caliber semi-automatic pistol lying on the floor. The Westerville Police Department were quickly summoned to the scene and found a single spent .38 caliber shell on Tony's bed. When they first arrived, the police noticed that Tony's car was missing from the garage, which initially made them suspect that he may have been killed by someone who stole the vehicle. However, they changed their tune once they found a drunk driving citation in the pocket of Tony's pants. It turned out that 2 days earlier, Tony had been pulled over and arrested by the Columbus Division of Police for driving while intoxicated, and they impounded his car. Tony was now facing possible fines and the suspension of his driver's license, so investigators felt this made him depressed enough to take his own life. Tony's autopsy revealed that he had likely been dead for several hours before his body was found, and with no apparent evidence of foul play, his death was officially ruled to be a suicide. Well, needless to say, Tony's family did not agree with this conclusion and were convinced he had been murdered. One detail which Cheryl Lombardi found troubling was the fact that Tony was nude when he died, and since he always hated for his family to see him in the nude, she did not think he would have wanted them to find him in that way if he took his own life. Tony also had bruises on his chest directly under his clenched hands, a broken jaw, and an unexplained 1.5-inch gash over his left eye, which made his parents suspect that he might have gotten into a struggle with an unknown assailant prior to his death. In addition, Tony's wristwatch was found broken and lying on the floor. While investigators felt that the trajectory of the bullet which passed through Tony's head was consistent with suicide, his family disagreed. When Tony's body was found, there were 2 pillows under his shoulders, and his head was above the pillows, but his parents maintained that the bullet hole in the headboard was behind the pillows, and if Tony had shot himself from that position, there's no way the bullet could have wound up there. They theorized that the bruises on his chest were caused by a third party who held Tony down before shooting him, and his body was then placed over the pillows. Like I just mentioned, Tony's autopsy indicated that he was killed sometime during the evening of the 29th and had been dead for hours by the time Cheryl returned home after midnight on the 30th. but Cheryl continued to maintain that the light was off inside Tony's bedroom when she arrived, and was on after she heard the sounds of the door slam and the footsteps at 12:45 a.m. This led Cheryl to theorize that Tony's killer was still hiding in his dark bedroom when she got home, and they subsequently turned on the light and fled the house while Cheryl was inside her own bedroom. However, the police were skeptical of Cheryl's theory, as they claimed that when she was first interviewed by a detective following the discovery of Tony's body, she said she could not remember what sort of noise she heard, and never specifically mentioned anything about a door closing or footsteps. A test was performed on Tony's hands, and the results confirmed that he had handled a metal object prior to his death. But while police believe these results indicated that Tony had fired a gun, Cheryl argued that it didn't prove anything because Tony's job at the baby food factory required him to frequently handle metal cans and objects. According to the Lombardis, there were at least 2 people who had threatened Tony in the week prior to his death. One of them was an unidentified man in a white pickup truck who had been seen by a next-door neighbor pulling up to the Lombardi residence right after Tony arrived home one night. This man reportedly screamed at Tony for cutting him off and asked him where he lived, and when Tony confirmed that he lived there, the man drove off. The Lombardis wondered if this man might have felt compelled to return to the residence to kill Tony at a later time, and claimed that police never bothered to interview the neighbor who saw the driver or follow up on this lead. Tony Lombardi Sr. said that the second threat against his son occurred just a few days after the incident with the driver. I mentioned earlier that Tony was believed to have been dating no less than 3 different women at the time of his death. Well, one of them apparently had a boyfriend whom she was living with, and when Tony Sr. checked his family's voicemail, he said that he heard a threatening message from this guy who warned Tony that he had a gun and would use it on him if Tony didn't stay away from his girlfriend. When Tony Sr. expressed his concern about this, his son told him not to worry about it because a friend of his was going to take care of the situation. Indeed, Tony's best friend, Andy Royer, said that he tried to mediate the whole situation and called the boyfriend up, but this guy supposedly told Andy that he would take care of Tony and that he would get what was coming to him. Andy claimed that the police never contacted him to inquire about this whole situation, but investigators said that they never found anything to substantiate these alleged threats against Tony and failed to uncover any evidence pointing towards third-party involvement in his death. The case would be featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, which aired in March of 1994, but the local sheriff's office, district attorney, and county coroner still continue to concur with the original ruling that Tony's death was a suicide. As far as I know, the episode did not lead to any substantial new tips that proved that Tony was the victim of foul play, so the story soon faded from the spotlight, and Tony Lombardi Sr. passed away in May of 2012 at the age of 67. So after 3 decades, Tony's death continues to remain shrouded in controversy. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So now let's move on to our next case. Our second story begins in 1991 in Galesburg, Illinois, a town located in Knox County which had a population of around 33,000 at that time. Our second victim is 23-year-old Danny Williams, who lives at a house he recently bought on Florence Street. Danny is the youngest of 3 sons to parents Larry and Lois Williams, who own Protexol, a multi-million-dollar industrial clothing and uniform manufacturing plant, and Danny has spent the past 2 years working for them as a distribution manager. On the evening of Sunday, June the 30th, Danny's parents had not heard from their son and were unable to reach him for 2 days, so Larry and Lois became concerned enough to pay a visit to his house. When they arrived, Larry received no answer to repeated knocks on the door, but since he had his own key, he decided to let himself inside. Larry knew that his son owned a gun, so he kept crying out, quote, "Danny, this is your dad," in hopes that Danny wouldn't mistake him for an intruder and open fire. However, when Larry entered the den, he was shocked to discover Danny's dead body on the couch. He was sitting in an upright position, but he had a 9mm semi-automatic Smith & Wesson pistol in his hand, which was resting on his lap, and a fatal shotgun wound in his forehead. The Galesburg Police Department were summoned to the scene, and it was quickly established that the pistol in Danny's hand belonged to him. On the surface, there did not appear to be any signs of struggle or forced entry, as the front door had been locked when Larry arrived, the windows were locked, and other doors were deadbolted. The pathologist who performed Danny's autopsy estimated that he was likely killed at around 2:30 a.m. on the morning of Saturday, June the 29th, a full day and a half before his body was discovered. Danny's friends also said that he was a heavy drinker, as at the time of his death, his blood alcohol level was 0.274, more than twice the legal limit for driving. His driver's license had also been revoked, and it was believed that Danny had been using drugs, as drug paraphernalia was found at his residence. According to Danny's friends and some of his family members, he did not get along with many of his co-workers and had recently gotten depressed over the fact that he did not receive a promotion. For his part, Larry disputed this, claiming that Danny was a partner in the business, so there wasn't much higher for him to go. Larry also felt that Danny's high blood alcohol level was misleading, since he said some pathologists told him that ethanol levels can build up in someone's body following their death. However, Danny had also been depressed about the fact that his girlfriend had broken up with him and moved out of his house about a month before he died. When the girlfriend was interviewed, she claimed that there was an incident from 6 months earlier when she got into an argument with Danny and he threatened suicide and pulled out his Smith & Wesson pistol. When the girlfriend turned around and tried to leave the room, she then heard the sound of the gun discharging and saw that Danny had fired a shot into the wall. The girlfriend also claimed that at around 2 a.m. on the morning of June the 29th, she received a phone call from Danny, who sounded like he had been drinking, and asked to see her. The girlfriend said no, and the call soon ended, but Danny was believed to have died a short time later. Based on this information, the Galesburg Police Department believed it was most likely that Danny took his own life. The pathologist, as well as a clinical psychologist who reviewed the case, also concluded that the gunshot wound was likely self-inflicted and that Danny's death was a suicide. But when the case was heard by a coroner's jury, they ruled that there was not enough evidence to classify his death as a suicide or a homicide, so they simply listed the cause of death as uncertain. Well, in spite of the personal problems Danny appeared to have been experiencing, his family did not believe the physical evidence supported the idea of suicide. As someone who had handled guns his entire life, Larry did not believe it would have been physically possible for Danny to shoot himself and have his gun land in his lap with his hand resting on top of it in what Larry described as an unnatural position. Larry hired a private detective named Mike Turnquist to perform an independent investigation into his son's death, and Turnquist soon spoke to a neighbor of Danny's named Darlene Sayers. As you recall, Danny's estimated time of death was around 2:30 a.m. on Saturday, June the 29th, but Sayers was convinced she had seen Danny alive about 8 hours later at 10:30 that morning. According to Sayers, she saw Danny exit his house and climb into a blue car with an unidentified woman who had dark hair and appeared to be between 25 to 30 years old. Well, it turned out that on the previous morning, Friday, June the 28th, Danny had been picked up at home by his mother Lois, which made police suspect that Sayers had actually seen them and got her dates mixed up. However, Sayers continued to maintain that she was certain her sighting of Danny took place on Saturday rather than Friday, and the woman in the blue car was too young to have been Lois, who was 49 years old at that time. Other witnesses claimed to have seen activity at Danny's residence on Sunday, June the 30th, which included an unidentified young man with curly brown hair who appeared to be approximately 5'4" and was standing outside the house. Once again, the Galesburg PD believed that these witnesses were sincere, but likely got their dates mixed up and saw this activity at Danny's house prior to his death. According to Mike Turnquist, the police never performed tests on Danny's hands to see if he had any powder burns on them to indicate he had fired a gun. Another troubling issue with the suicide theory was that when the bullet which supposedly passed through Danny's head was removed from the wall behind him, there was only one small spot which appeared to be blood on the paneling rather than a large amount of blood spatter. This compelled Larry to hire an independent forensic scientist named Mark Bosey, who decided to pay a visit to Danny's house and use a laser luminescence scanner which can detect organic matter, including blood, which is not easily visible to the naked eye. To Bosey's surprise, the scanner detected very little organic matter on the wall behind the couch, but it did find potential traces of blood in many other sections of the house, including on the television set, which was located on the opposite side of the room from the couch. Some of the blood found throughout the house was type B, which was Danny's type, but there were also traces of type O blood in various places, including the bathroom and inside the pocket of Danny's jeans. Regardless, the presence of two different blood types seemed to suggest that an additional person besides Danny may have shed blood inside his house. The Galesburg PD did not put much credence into Bosey's findings, as they felt the blood samples may have been compromised by the crew who cleaned up the crime scene after Danny's body was removed. The adulterated samples were also not collected until 6 weeks after Danny's death, so the Illinois State Crime Lab argued that they were not fresh enough to be definitively typed, and there was no way to determine just how long the blood traces had been there. A shell casing from Danny Smith & Wesson was found at the scene the same time his body was, but weeks later, when Bosey was processing the den, he opened up the fold-out bed on the couch and another shell casing suddenly fell out. Testing would later determine that the shell came out of Danny's gun and had recently been fired. Since Danny only had one gunshot wound in his forehead, this suggested that a second shot had been fired either by Danny or an unknown party. Bosey tried to perform a reenactment of Danny's alleged suicide, but based on the trajectory of the bullet, he concluded that if Danny had shot himself, he would have fallen forward onto the floor and dropped his gun rather than being found upright on the couch with the gun in his lap. As a result, Bosey concluded that Danny was murdered by someone who staged his death to look like a suicide and used Danny's gun to fire a shot through the wall behind the couch. Bosey developed a theory that Danny may have gotten into an altercation with someone at another location before he was shot and killed. This person then transported Danny's body back to his house and dug out Danny's keys to unlock the front door, which could have explained the presence of the type O blood in the pocket of Danny's jeans. His body was then placed on the couch and the suicide was staged. The case would be featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries which aired in September of 1993, and during his interview, Larry expressed his belief that since the Galesburg PD immediately reached a conclusion of suicide, they went to a great deal of effort to try and support their theory and ignored conflicting evidence. Larry also claimed that he had received several anonymous phone calls from people who said they knew the identity of Danny's killer but were afraid to name names. This prompted Larry to place ads in several newspapers offering a $25,000 reward for information, which led to the arrest and conviction of a suspect. For his part, Galesburg Police Chief John Schlaff agreed to be interviewed on the show, and while he continued to express his belief that Danny's death was a suicide, he acknowledged that the department had kept the investigation open in order to cooperate with the Williams family. After the Unsolved Mysteries broadcast, over 60 calls arrived at their telecenter, but many of them were mistakenly forwarded to Mike Turnquist rather than the Galesburg PD, which prompted the show to apologize to Chief Schlaff for their error. Nonetheless, Turnquist told the press that some of the tips he received were promising and mentioned names which had never come up in the investigation before. But in the end, this did not lead the case any closer to a resolution or pave the way to Danny's death being reclassified as a homicide. Tragically, Larry Williams passed away in April of 1998 at the age of 58, while Danny's mother Lois died in November of 2010 at the age of 68. After more than 30 years, there are still no conclusive answers about Danny's death. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So by this point, the trail went cold has covered nearly all of the suspicious suicide cases which were featured on Unsolved Mysteries, and I have the exact same viewpoint for many of them. When I saw the presentation of these stories on TV several years ago, I usually took them at face value and automatically believed that foul play had taken place. But as time has gone on, I've come to realize that mental health is a very complicated thing, and that the families of suicide victims can sometimes experience extreme denial when they go through such a tragedy. And in retrospect, it's apparent that many of these suicide cases from Unsolved Mysteries were presented in a biased and slanted fashion. I decided to cover the cases of Tony Lombardi and Danny Williams together on this same episode because of their numerous similarities, as they both feature young men in their early 20s who supposedly died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound inside their own home. On the surface, one key difference is that Tony seemed to have less going on in his life than Danny and would appear to be a more likely candidate for suicide. At the time of his death, Tony was still living at home with his parents and working what he may have felt was a boring, dead-end job on the line at a baby food factory, and his recent DUI arrest and the possibility of losing his license could have been a breaking point which pushed him towards suicide. By contrast, Danny had a good job working at his family's manufacturing plant and had seemingly acquired enough money to purchase his own house at a young age. But while it appeared like he was doing well, Unsolved Mysteries did acknowledge that he had once threatened suicide in front of his ex-girlfriend. But as we're going to discuss very soon, the show also downplayed and left out other key pieces of information which could have pointed towards Danny being suicidal. One common trait in a lot of these suspicious suicide cases is that the victims' families would often hire independent experts to re-examine the evidence, and they usually uncover odd discrepancies which further the family's belief that foul play took place. But as far as I know, Tony Lombardi's parents did not do this, so we really only have their word about some of the sketchy details surrounding his death. And that's a bit troubling, because this is one of those cases in which there is zero information available out there from outside sources besides Unsolved Mysteries, so you have to wonder if we're getting the full story here. A common red flag I've noticed in their presentation of these suspicious suicide stories is that when the victim supposedly died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound and a firearm was found at the scene, the show would neglect to mention where it originally came from. I mean, you would think that if the victim normally didn't have access to a gun, this would be treated as a much bigger deal, so I usually assume that if nothing was said, the gun was probably connected to the victim in some way. Sure enough, this exact thing happened in the presentation of some other firearm-related suicide cases, such as Tommy Burkett and Rayanne Mosser, as I previously covered them on my podcast, and when digging up additional information from outside sources, I learned that the gun either originated from the victim's home or belonged to one of their family members. To be fair, I do still think there's a good chance that the Tommy Burkett case was murder and his suicide was staged, but since Unsolved Mysteries never made any mention of where the .38 caliber semi-automatic pistol in Tony Lombardi's bedroom originated from, I'm automatically going to assume that his family kept a gun like that in their home, and Tony would have had access to it. It's mentioned that a test was performed to determine that Tony had handled a metal object prior to his death, which his mother Cheryl tried to explain away by saying that he often handled metal cans at his job. However, I find it odd that it's never specifically stated if Tony had gunshot residue on his hand, which would be pretty convincing evidence that he fired the gun. But does this mean there was no gunshot residue, or was this a detail the show conveniently left out? I never really picked up on this until after watching the Unsolved Mysteries segment several times, but even though they mentioned that Tony was killed by a single gunshot wound to the head and that the bullet became lodged in the headboard, they never specify where exactly on his head he was shot. I only bring this up because one of the details that Cheryl used to support the idea of foul play and Tony possibly getting into a struggle prior to his death was him having a broken jaw. But if Tony shot himself through the mouth or anywhere near his mouth, the force of the gunshot could have been what caused his jaw to become broken. The other details which Cheryl mentions to support foul play and a possible struggle are bruises on Tony's chest, a small gash over his left eye, and a broken watch on the floor. Like I said earlier, I see nothing to indicate that any independent forensic experts were brought in to examine the evidence, so the only source of these details is Cheryl during her Unsolved Mysteries interview. She even presents a recreation in front of the camera to demonstrate how it would have been impossible for Tony to shoot himself since the bullet hole in the headboard was behind the pillows Tony's body was resting on. But we don't have access to any of the crime scene photos or the autopsy report or official documentation to verify that these points are true. How can we be certain that Tony didn't receive these bruises and the gash from some previous unrelated incidents which occurred long before his death? Of course, Cheryl is also the sole source of the biggest detail pointing towards the involvement of an outside party, and that's her claim that the light in Tony's bedroom was turned on during the time period between when she returned home and when she discovered Tony's body. And she also said that the light only went on after she heard the sound of a door closing and some footsteps. If Cheryl is telling the truth, then this would seem like pretty convincing evidence that there was an intruder inside Tony's bedroom at the time Cheryl returned home, who subsequently turned on the light and snuck out of the house without being seen. However, the problem is that this scenario seems at odds with the timeline of events. It would be one thing if the intruder had killed Tony right before Cheryl entered the house and they didn't get a chance to immediately escape, but the autopsy did conclude that Tony had been dead for several hours before his body was found. This seems to be supported by the fact that Tony did not show up for his shift at the baby food factory that evening and never called in, which means it wouldn't make much sense for him to still be alive at home at around midnight, which is when Cheryl arrived. If someone did murder Tony inside his bedroom before he had a chance to leave for his shift, then why were they still there several hours later? Now, Tony's family presented two potential theories involving someone who might have had the motive to kill him. The first one is based on the account from a neighbor who claimed that they saw an unidentified man in a pickup truck threaten Tony outside his house for cutting him off, and he confirmed that this was where Tony lived before he drove away. This incident supposedly took place in the week prior to Tony's death, and while I have no reason to believe that the neighbor isn't telling the truth, and Tony's encounter with the angry driver didn't happen, it seems like a stretch to believe that this guy would return to kill Tony over something as trivial as cutting him off. Yes, road rage sometimes drives people to commit murder in the heat of the moment, but I'm not so sure it compels them to return to the home of a complete stranger days later in order to kill them and stage their death to look like a suicide. The second theory about Tony possibly being killed by the jealous boyfriend of a woman he had been dating seems a lot more plausible, but the problem is that we don't know any details about this boyfriend or have enough information about the situation. According to Tony Lombardi Sr., this guy left a threatening voicemail for his son, but it's never been mentioned if he kept the recording of this voicemail or turned it over to the police. And Tony's best friend, Andy Royer, claimed that the boyfriend said that Tony would, quote-unquote, get what's coming to him. One argument that Cheryl used against the idea of Tony's death being a suicide is that he was found nude, and she believed that he never would have allowed his family to find him in that fashion. Theoretically, if you believe Tony was murdered in some sort of love triangle, I could see a scenario where Tony decided to skip his shift at work in order to spend the evening with his girlfriend, but her boyfriend caught them in bed together and killed Tony. This could provide a possible explanation for why Tony was found in the nude, but this theory is all based on speculation, and it doesn't sound like investigators found any evidence to support the theory or that the boyfriend had any involvement in Tony's death. Besides, I somehow doubt that the boyfriend and girlfriend would be hiding out in the bedroom together while Cheryl was in the house, and another issue is that I don't believe there were any signs of forced entry at the residence, since Cheryl didn't notice anything out of the ordinary when she returned home. If this guy had been threatening Tony, would he really invite him inside his house and allow him upstairs into his bedroom? With all the evidence and information that we have, I really can't think of a homicide theory which makes much sense. However, the idea of Tony dealing with undiagnosed mental health issues and depression and reaching his breaking point over his DUI and having his car impounded and possibly losing his license does make sense. One detail which has never been shared is how exactly Tony was planning to travel to his shift at the factory on the evening of the 29th, since he no longer had his car. It's never been mentioned if anyone was going to give Tony a ride or if he was planning to use public transportation, so perhaps he figured that the loss of his license and his car were going to make it impossible for him to keep his job, so he decided to end it all. I feel really bad for Cheryl and Tony Sr. because it looks like Tony was their only child, so losing him in this fashion must have been devastating, and it's possible they just felt they needed someone to blame in order to deal with their grief, which is why they convinced themselves that he was the victim of foul play. According to police, when Cheryl was first interviewed, she downplayed the significance of the noise she heard before the discovery of her son's body, and never specifically mentioned the sound of the door closing or the footsteps. It sounds like she retroactively added these details in order to make it sound like she heard Tony's killer, so for all we know, perhaps she did the same thing with the detail about the light going on inside Tony's bedroom. This doesn't necessarily mean that Cheryl was intentionally lying, but perhaps the trauma of the whole ordeal convinced her she saw this inconsistency with the light, and she's built upon it to create a non-existent homicide scenario. Unfortunately, this is all too common with families and friends of suicide victims who will often find themselves in denial and do everything they can to dream up alternate scenarios where their loved one was murdered. But in this particular case, there just isn't much evidence pointing towards that scenario. I know that Tony Sr. has passed away, and since it does not sound like the Unsolved Mysteries segment led to any new tips which supported foul play, I do hope that Tony Sr. and Cheryl did eventually find peace with the whole situation. Now, moving on to Danny Williams' case, the ironic thing is that even though you could argue there is more convincing evidence to support foul play for him, the one thing his case doesn't have are potential suspects with a motive for murder. While the Lombardi family at least presented a semi-plausible scenario about Tony being killed by a jealous boyfriend, the Unsolved Mysteries segment flat out acknowledged that even though the Williams family were convinced Danny was murdered, they had no idea who could have been responsible. I read in one newspaper article that when the Galesburg Police Department were summoned to Danny's residence, his father Larry initially told them that he believed his death looked like a suicide. And when he was interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries, Larry even admitted that when he found his son's body, the first thing he said was, quote, "Oh Dan, don't let this be what it looks like." So that definitely indicates to me that Danny's family felt he would have been capable of suicide, as it sounds like he was experiencing a number of personal problems at that time. Ever since I first watched the Unsolved Mysteries segment, I thought it was a bit of a red flag how casually they mentioned that Danny's driver's license had been revoked, which is why his mother had to pick him up at his house and give him a ride the day before he was believed to have been killed. Unlike their segment about Tony Lombardi, they never bothered to explain why Danny's license was revoked, but after learning that his blood alcohol level was 0.274 at the time of his death, it's not hard to imagine how this happened. By the way, that detail about the blood alcohol level was left out on Unsolved Mysteries, as was the fact that he was alleged to have had a drinking and drug problem, and drug paraphernalia was found at his residence. They also did not mention that Danny appeared to be depressed at that time about not getting a promotion, and he didn't get along with many of his coworkers. And while they revealed that Danny had broken up with his girlfriend, and there was a prior incident where he threatened suicide in front of her and fired a gunshot into the wall, they did not mention that Danny had made a drunken phone call to her at 2 a.m. on June the 29th, and she refused his request to come see him. When you consider the fact that Danny was believed to have died at 2:30 a.m., a very short time after this call ended, then this definitely seems like an even stronger case for suicide than Tony Lombardi. By the way, one other piece of information not shared in the segment is that before he hired Mike Turnquist to look into his son's death, Larry had hired the services of Steve Johnson, a former investigator for the Knox County Sheriff's Department, but Johnson wound up concurring with the police's position that Danny's death was a suicide. In so many of these suspicious suicide cases, the victims' families will hire independent experts to take a fresh look at the evidence, and they often agree with the family's conclusion, but you almost sense that Larry was going to keep hiring experts until he found one who told him what he wanted to hear. All that being said, even though there is a compelling case for this being suicide, the findings of forensic scientist Mark Bosey do provide some doubt, as the possible traces of type O blood in the house, which did not match Danny's blood type, which was type B, suggest that another party may have been present when he was killed. Remember, even though the police believed that Danny's death was a suicide, a coroner's jury did not believe there was enough evidence to support suicide or homicide, so the official ruling for his death was uncertain, and I'm guessing these forensic findings may have created enough reasonable doubt for them to conclusively state that Danny killed himself. The Galesburg PD argued that Bosey's findings were unreliable, as these blood traces were so small that they were not easily visible to the naked eye, which is why they were not noticed by the original investigators who processed the crime scene. They believed that the samples may have been contaminated when the scene was cleaned up, and since they were not collected until 6 weeks after the fact, it was impossible to correctly type them. This argument was countered by a forensic scientist named Cecilia Guzman, who noted that King Tut's blood was typed, even though he died thousands of years ago, so they could surely type blood samples that were only 6 weeks old. Now, keep in mind that we're talking 1991 forensics here, and the field has advanced so much that if Danny's death took place today, we might have gotten a much clearer interpretation of the evidence. DNA profiling was still a relatively new thing back then, so I do not believe the blood traces were ever tested for DNA, though who knows if the samples would have been large enough for that. During the Unsolved Mystery segment, it was reported that a forensic scientist who specialized in blood pattern analysis was testing the traces of blood found on the television set in Danny's den, but they were still awaiting the results. Obviously, since Danny was found on the couch and the TV was located directly across the room, it would have been impossible for the blood to get there when Danny shot himself, but since I can't find any further information about the results of the testing, they may not have much relevance to the case. For all we know, perhaps the blood wound up there from a separate incident on a previous occasion long before Danny was killed. We do know that traces of type O blood were found in Danny's bathroom and inside the pocket of his jeans. During one newspaper article about this case, Larry claimed that traces of type O blood were found on a sheet which was underneath Danny's body on the couch. But the article also reported that coroner's photos did not show this sheet on the couch, so I might take Larry's claim with a grain of salt. The type O blood in the bathroom could imply that someone got into a struggle with Danny before killing him, but I don't find it implausible that another person could have bled inside the bathroom for completely unrelated reasons on a date prior to Danny's death. But the trace of type O blood in Danny's pocket is admittedly weird, as I'm not sure how it could have wound up there by accident. Once again, if this blood was found today, they might be able to use DNA testing to determine who it belonged to, but I see no indication this was ever done. For all we know, more modern testing could possibly discount the idea that the blood is even type O and prove that it actually belonged to Danny instead. The theory presented by Mark Bosey is that Danny could have been killed at another location by someone who transported his body back to his house to stage his suicide. If Danny had gotten into a struggle with this person which caused them to bleed, they may have transferred traces of their own blood to Danny's pocket when they reached in there to grab his keys to unlock the front door. But the big hole in this theory is that by Larry's own admission, the door was locked when he arrived at the house, so he had to pull out his own key to get inside to find Danny's body. If the killer took Danny's house keys with them when they left the scene, they could have locked the door behind them, but I haven't read anything to indicate that these keys went missing, and I'm sure it would have been treated as a big deal if they were. The other troubling piece of evidence was Mark Bosey's discovery of a second shell casing inside Danny's couch weeks after his death, and regardless of where you stand on this case, it's pretty troubling that the police missed it the first time around. I don't believe a second bullet hole was ever found at the scene, but it was established that the second casing originated from Danny's Smith & Wesson pistol. So does this mean that Danny or someone else used the gun to fire a second shot? Virtually no blood spatter was found around the bullet hole in the wall behind Danny's couch, which is furthered speculation that Danny was shot elsewhere and the responsible party fired a bullet into the wall to stage his suicide. But the issue is that the presence of two shell casings at the scene seems to go against Bosey's theory that Danny was fatally shot at another location. During his Unsolved Mysteries interview, Galesburg Police Chief John Schlaff downplayed the significance of the lack of blood spatter on the wall behind the couch, stating that this does not always happen, and the assumption about gunshot wounds automatically leaving a large amount of blood is based mostly on what you see in movies and TV shows. We know that Danny's girlfriend claimed that he fired off a shot from the same gun during an argument they had at the house 6 months earlier, so could it be possible that it caused a shell casing to be ejected and trapped inside the couch and no one noticed it there for months? But let's just suppose that Bosey's theory is correct and Danny was killed at another location. Where did this take place and who could have been responsible? It's always been estimated that Danny's death took place at 2:30 a.m. on the morning of Saturday, June the 29th, a day and a half before his body was found. But what complicates things is that Danny was allegedly seen alive after his so-called time of death. I have to admit that the big highlight of the Unsolved Mysteries segment is the interview with Darlene Sayers, the elderly neighbor who claimed she saw Danny climbing into a car with a young woman several hours after he was supposedly killed. She had no qualms about going on national TV and saying, quote, "I shouldn't admit it, but I watch everybody's business. It was Saturday morning that I saw Danny get in the car with this woman. So naturally, being nosy as I am, I looked over her real good." End quote. If Sayers is accurate, Perhaps this woman was involved in Danny's death and transported his body back to the house, but police are certain that Sayers got her dates mixed up and actually saw Danny being picked up by his mother Lois on Friday, June the 28th. This seems fairly plausible to me, but while Sayers believed that this woman was about twice as young as Lois, I might put more stock into her sighting if anyone had any idea who this woman might have been, or if there was anyone matching her description who had a motive to kill Danny. There were other witnesses who reported seeing activity outside Danny's house over the course of the weekend, including an unidentified short man with curly hair, but since it doesn't sound like these witnesses saw Danny himself, I'm not sure how significant this is. I don't know how accurate the Unsolved Mysteries segment is, but they present a reenactment of this curly-haired man standing on the porch outside the front door before he peeks in through the window and then turns around and leaves. To me, it looks like nothing more than someone stopping by the house and getting no answer at the front door, possibly because Danny was already dead inside. So even though the witnesses may have actually seen this curly-haired man, I'm not sure I would classify this activity as suspicious, and he may have been nothing more than an innocent bystander. So for many years, this was one case that I was always 50-50 on, because while I felt there were enough odd discrepancies to cast reasonable doubt over Danny's death being a suicide, I couldn't figure out a logical motive why anyone would want to murder him. And it seems like the coroner's jury who examined the case felt the same way, since they classified his death as uncertain rather than suicide, which seems fair to me. Like I mentioned earlier, when Chief Schlaff was interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries, he said that the Galesburg PD was keeping the investigation open in order to cooperate with Danny's family. I implied this to mean that even though the police were not going to devote much time and resources to actively working on the case, they would be willing to follow up on any new tips or leads if they received information to indicate that a homicide had actually taken place. Since it doesn't appear like any compelling new evidence of foul play has surfaced these past 30 years, I do think it's most likely that Danny took his own life. To me, there are more than enough red flags for me to believe the suicide theory, as Danny did appear to have a drinking and drug problem during this time period, and it's apparent that he had a hard time getting over his breakup with his girlfriend. It's very telling that the last time Danny was confirmed to be alive was when he made his drunken 2 a.m. phone call to his girlfriend and she refused his request to see him. Since Danny was believed to have died less than half an hour after this call ended, it's possible this was his breaking point. If you disregard some of the other pieces of evidence, such as Darlene Sayers sighting, the second shell casing, and the presence of typo blood in Danny's pocket, then the suicide scenario makes perfect sense. While I ultimately land on suicide for both of today's featured cases, I do think they're still worth discussing, as Danny and Tony's deaths took place during a time period when there was less of an understanding about suicide and mental health issues, and I think this is why their loved ones had a hard time dealing with it. So I do hope that the Williams and Lombardi families eventually found peace with what happened. All that being said, if you happen to have any information about the deaths of Tony Lombardi or Danny Williams, which suggests that they actually were the victims of foul play, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released nearly 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available on our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a Halloween-themed bonus episode about reincarnation, which covers the controversial Unsolved Mysteries segment about Georgia Rudolph and her belief that she was the reincarnation of a young woman who died at the turn of the 20th century. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Pathwind Chili, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss a bizarre case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1984 disappearance and subsequent death of Tim Molnar. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have nearly 70 of these commentary tracks in archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Trish, Tara B, Haley C, Mystery 5162, and Lynn T. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.